On January 23rd, 1855, a bridge opened over the Mississippi River in a place we call Minneapolis. Naturalist and zoologist Clinton Hart Merriam, who would later name and document dozens of mammals across North America, was born that year, as was astronomer Percival Lowell, who suggested Mars was inhabited by intelligent life and predicted the eventual discovery of Pluto. Former Congressman Abraham Lincoln lost an election to represent Illinois in the U.S. Senate. An opera based on the story Rip Van Winkle premiered. 2 towns called Northfield and Faribault in the young Minnesota Territory were platted out. This is the 1855 History Podcast, a podcast about Minnesota, the 19th century, and doing history. I am Sam Temple. I produce documentaries with my co-host here, Logan Ledman. And Logan, I am longing to be part of the story Rip Van Winkle, because this episode, thinking about this episode, makes me want to sleep for 100 years. How are you today?
I'm good. I slept very long last night, actually, so I got that built up in me before we watched this episode. Sam, this was a bad episode of Ken Burns' Civil War documentary series.
I would argue, yeah.
We've been going through the Civil War series that Ken Burns put out in 1990, and I would say overall we've enjoyed our time, the time we've spent going through this series. We had some great words.
I was really coming around to it. I was hesitant to really enjoy this, and it took me a little bit to get into the groove, but especially the last few episodes I was really enjoying. And I guess I didn't realize that this episode wasn't as good as the previous episodes until we started talking about it, and I started to think about it, and I was like, well, what really happened? You know, what was the narrative? So far, the really good episodes of this series work really as their standalone narratives, as these individual pieces that are only further enhanced by being accompanied. And this one, not only does it not have a lot to do on its own, it doesn't feel like any of the information presented here couldn't have been part of other episodes. That's not to say the events in it aren't important to the narrative of the Civil War, but when we're talking about pacing, we're talking about storytelling. The events took place in this one didn't feel as consequential, or at least not as narratively compelling independently as the last couple episodes that we've really enjoyed have been.
Yeah, let's situate our viewers in where this episode drops us within the context of the other episodes. So we've hit Gettysburg. We're in 1864. We're in the beginning stages of the March to the Sea of William T. Sherman. We've wrapped up Vicksburg. The Confederacy is on its last legs already, and the election of 1864 looms in the horizon for the uncertain President Abraham Lincoln in the Union. So there's certainly plenty of drama in 1864, of course. The wide-scale mobilization of black troops for the Union takes place in 1864. Obviously, the taking of Atlanta, the election itself, all of these, there are a lot of great strains of content, and they're all engaged with in some form or another in this episode. But I think let's talk a little bit about where Burns goes wrong. What are some of the decisions narratively, historically, that he makes that didn't work for us in this episode?
Yeah, I think rather than setting out at the beginning to talk about the stakes of what's going on with the war, the stakes of what's going on with the election, and it eventually gets there. It eventually talks about what might be going through Lincoln's head or what might be going on to the sentiment of the nation. But there isn't a lot of talk about either campaigning by Lincoln or by his acolytes or his opponent or people on Lincoln's behalf or anything like that. It mostly is just, well, there's an election coming. We'll see what happens. Oh, the election came. Okay. And we start with a totally inconsequential anecdote and story. And once again, this is a recurring theme. I've come to appreciate Shelby Foote for what he does in this series. But again, we start an episode with the cold open being Shelby Foote telling a little story. And this time, the episode opens with Shelby Foote calling two people a genius, one of them being Abraham Lincoln, the other being Confederate leader Nathan Bedford Forrest, who later on was a prominent member of the KKK. And I say that because the episode and previous episodes fail to mention it. And that's something that I really struggle with. We've talked about others' beliefs, and other people have been summed up in a sentence or so. And Forrest, in the opening sequence of this episode alone, gets much more than a sentence to sum him up, and very little is done there. But the sentences that are chosen are talking about what a military genius he was and what a leader he was. And what was interesting, throughout this episode, it's not just historians like Shelby Foote who are praising Forrest. The narrator also, at least in my opinion, kind of provides some of the romanticized, sort of the epic storytelling that's sometimes associated with the Civil War. And that was interesting because normally, at least what you and I have kind of settled on, Logan, is the historians are there to sort of present this, the color. They're there to present the anecdotes, the legacy, the perception of these different figures, the analysis. And then David McCullough, our narrator, is there to present what we should take as cold, hard facts. And in this case, the narrator is used to present what might be truthful accounts of Forrest's wartime experience, but still contributes to the perception set out by Foote that he was a genius of a leader. For one thing, that doesn't set up the narrative stakes at all for the episode. You know, Forrest does have a big impact on what's going on in the story this week, but it doesn't set up the stakes for the overall war or anything like that, because the introduction isn't even talking about that. It's just talking about this one guy and how interesting this one guy is, but not interesting in a, oh, he's a really complex character, and if you take him in his totality, there's this internal contradictions about this guy and the complicated legacy, you know, all the stuff that other characters, other players in this war have gotten.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, so we've gotten a very nuanced look at Lee or even Lincoln, of talking about not just how they were perceived at the time, but how they've been perceived in the generations after the Civil War. We've gotten that with other figures. Especially, we talked about this last week, I was really impressed with even what Foote was doing with Lee, and said it's difficult to talk about this guy because of everything that has come after. And I really appreciated that. We had high praise for last week's episode. But then you have a figure who arguably isn't as publicly known. You know, you're more likely to go to a Robert E. Lee high school than you are a Nathan Bedford Forrest, though they are out there.
Sure.
So Robert E. Lee is more in the public consciousness. But Forrest, at the same time, is still extremely visible, is still extremely celebrated. And I thought that there was just as much ample room for a nuanced conversation, if you're going to have a conversation about Forrest, to take his legacy into account. And he was mentioned in the first episode, I believe, and we said, well, let's see if we hear any more about him. Here we are. There's only 2 episodes after this, and they've already devoted a lot of time to Forrest in this episode alone, and not a single mention of some of the after-war actions that he takes.
We haven't talked about the after-war life of any individual characters, though we have talked about the legacy of things. But I will say that we talked about Forrest's life before the war, and I will say that one thing they said about his biography before the war was they described him as he made himself millions with cotton trading and trading slaves, selling slaves. And by saying that I don't know, I think there's part of the narrative framing for Forrest as a character here is as a self-made man of some kind. There's the fact that he enters the war as a low-ranking soldier and ends it as a lieutenant colonel, I believe. And they brush over the fact that when you are making your money off of selling slaves, you're not making money yourself. I agree that first of all, that it's a very bizarre choice to open the episode with Forrest. It doesn't link up with the story told by the episode really in any way. And I also agree that for the general framing for Forrest, not only is it less entertaining and engaging than it might otherwise be, but it is also just faulty.
And this isn't the first time. There have been other times when there's the description of something Forrest has done in a battle, and extra time is taken on, here's this badass story about Nathan Bedford Forrest. So this isn't the first time that it's done that. And to your point, because it doesn't serve a narrative function, maybe if the episode was building toward an action that Forrest took, but rather this is more building toward the election, or more
Right.
building toward other churnings going on in the nation in 1864. So you have to ask, if this isn't serving a narrative purpose, and it doesn't seem to be contributing to an overall conversation that this episode is trying to have, all that you have left is really just stories about how cool this guy is. It feels like a big old swing and a miss. Just kind of throws you off your balance for the episode.
I think you're right. I think swing and a miss is a good way to think about it. The Civil War is full of anecdotes and unbelievable stories and people who had experiences beyond what we can comprehend. I think Ken Burns's fascination with Shelby Foote as a narrative storyteller leads him astray sometimes. And Shelby Foote is clearly in love with Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Ken Burns, to some extent, is in love with Shelby Foote. Barbara Fields shows up in a couple episodes. I was reading a little bit about this episode before we started recording. Barbara Fields is the only historian featured in this series to have a PhD, and she's an expert on the Civil War, on 19th century history, and she's only ever brought up to talk about Black people. She's an expert on any number of these topics. And again, not only, unlike Shelby Foote, is she a trained historian, but she has a PhD trained by C. Van Woodward, the premier Civil War and Reconstruction historian of the last century, that she's barely utilized as a resource. What Shelby Foote has going for him is that he's a very engaging character. I think in a previous episode, we talked about that. He has this sense that he's twiddling his pipe and we're sitting at the campfire with him and he's telling us stories. That's valuable in some ways, but it really does need to be, it can't be a guiding light for a documentary, and it needs to be balanced out. It's most effective even when it's balanced out by other sources.
It should be brought up that Fields is also herself Black, and that can't help but come across as somewhat intentional, that she is only brought up to tell those stories, I think is what you were getting at. We've got a representative, we've got a novelist, and a smattering of other historians. But you're right, the balance of utilizing different individuals does feel a little off. And I guess what makes this episode so much more frustrating is that the last one, I feel like, could have had all of these same pitfalls, but it didn't. It hit those notes right. It knew how to use Foote in balance with other historians. It knew how to balance talking about someone during the Civil War with how they are perceived in the post-war years and the legacy that they've had over generations. I feel like the last episode did that really well. And so then that just makes it really, in a lot of ways, inexcusable for this one to fail so miserably at it. And that just makes it really disappointing. So let's talk a little bit more about some other narrative things that go on here. In a lot of episodes, and this one is no exception, you got the cold open from Shelby Foote, you get the and the title sequence, and then you get the narrator saying, there was fighting in this place. 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 It was a war all over, or something like that. You know what I mean? A lot of episodes start this way, and we get it again. So in case you don't realize it, there was fighting all over the place. We get a little more aerial footage in this one, so that was interesting. We noted that last time. And really, the crux of this episode seems to be based around the election. The election is coming, and Lincoln is expected to lose. And if he does lose, then the war is essentially over. There's infiltration from the Confederacy. There's Union citizens and generals and politicians who want to just appease and move on, whether it's a reunion or it's two states or anything like that. Another interesting thing that, if you're going to But if part of what this makes it feel like padding is it feels like we spent a lot more time in 1863 and 1864 than we did in 1861 or 1862, when there is enough nuance for it to be evenly spread out, or for you could have a whole series on a single year in the Civil War. But for some reason, we're spending a lot of time in these last few. And so if you're going to do that, maybe you could focus on one of the most interesting things of the war, and that's the espionage and the spying that's going on. But you kind of just get a paragraph rambling about allusions to particular spies and experiences, and then we move on.
Right, and that's one of the things that the episode does. That's one of the flaws of this episode in particular, is that it selects topics that I guess it feels like it couldn't fit into other episodes. Things like prisoner of war camps, spies,
gambling, drinking, and brothels.
Right, yeah, so soldier camp life, prisoners and spies we all get. And so the camp life is fine. The camp life section is pretty good. But you could engage with prisoner of war camps or espionage in a much more in-depth way than this episode does. You could do I could envision a documentary series that takes a whole episode to focus on espionage. A whole episode where you get to talk about ways that women participated in the war, ways that escaped slaves who, before enslaved people were brought into the Union Army, assisted with the Union, things like that. There's a real well of material in the prisoner of war camps and in espionage that it's touched on a little bit, but there's so many topics that this episode tries to dance on that none of them are really engaged with in depth, perhaps with the exception of Atlanta, the burning of Atlanta. I think he takes his time with that. It is very sentimentalized.
Yeah.
Probably appropriately. Yeah. So there's that.
It's crucial. It was a moment that for the North and the South was critical in the memory of the war, in how people discussed and experienced the war. And you have a lot of primary accounts, and that's very engaging. And to me, that's when it can warrant, if it's someone who lived through it, romanticizing it, or someone who lived through it, using the rose-tinted glasses, that at least, shouldn't be taken word for word as fact if it's clear that they're romanticizing, but at least you're giving that historical account. At least you're getting it from a person who actually experienced that. And I thought that was very good when it was used. There was one story that was just incredibly moving, and the war is filled with stuff like this. There was a battle, and there was a brief moment where one soldier was playing a cornet, and there was just a brief respite in the firing where both sides just sat and listened for a little bit, and it panned across a photograph, and it was just playing a cornet solo, and it was a beautiful moment, and you felt it because, like the soldiers, you're getting this barrage of sound effects and battle imagery and all this, and then to have this brief pause was really, really beautiful. So there are parts of this that are done really well. The whole episode just feels really disjointed. And because every piece of this feels like it could be so interesting, I guess that's just what makes spending so much time having an uninteresting conversation about Nathan Bedford Forrest all the more frustrating. But let's talk a little bit more. You brought up the prisoner camps. And since you brought it up, let's talk a little bit more about that. That's one of the last pieces that comes into this episode, or at least it comes later on in the episode, where they talk about Union soldiers held in Confederate camps. And at one point, I believe in response to the Fort Pillow Massacre, the Union and Confederacy cease prisoner exchange. And the Confederacy simply doesn't have or chooses not to supply, furnish, and feed the Union prisoners. And there were some photographs that were shown of emaciated soldiers who were literally skin and bone or less than that. It was really haunting, but really, really excellent storytelling, really excellent history that was being shown. And I thought it was handled very well, especially with primary sources that were used, mixing it with the imagery. Ken Burns says that what inspired him to do this series was seeing and experiencing all of the wonderful photographs. And you can tell really what this episode and what the Ken Burns style has come to be known as. Really, I think it's obvious that it began as sort of a love letter, a fascination to these photographs that bring these stories to life. And that section is very effective.
Another section that I think was really effective was actually the ending story about the establishment of Arlington National Cemetery.
Oh, that was fantastic.
That was really wonderful. I hadn't seen...
Tell us about it. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so here we get the really wonderful framing of Arlington National Cemetery being personalized into the story of one man, essentially, who has serious grief and resentment towards the Confederacy, partially as a result of his own son dying as a Union soldier. And in a really poignant symbol of that serious pain, he lays the dead soldiers of the Union at the feet of Robert E. Lee, and Robert E. Lee's Arlington plantation becomes a Union military hospital, and it is an intentional choice by this man that the dead Union soldiers be laid in the places where Robert E. Lee and his wife would enjoy their little walks around their slave labor camp and feast. I had never seen Arlington told in that way, as a very, very intimate and really poignant story. And it was really effectively told in this episode, I thought. So that was a victory for this episode.
Yeah, and that man himself was a Southerner. Who continued to work for the Union. I agree, that was incredibly moving, and I didn't know that was the history of Arlington, and that they needed a new national cemetery because it was full. And that was just really expertly done, really well told, really incredible story. So I'm not going to read too much into the fact that both of us enjoyed the last section of this documentary and by the ending, because we also talk about the Battle of Atlanta. And I thought the things that worked in the past worked well here. The mix of a painting with good sound design, the map style with the overlay of arrows and stuff, it works for me. One part that I thought we should follow up on, because it's come up a little bit, we get a lot of talk about the internal squabbling and politics of the military and the executive in the Union, and we're curious about whether we'll get any of that in the Confederacy. And there was a hint. There was a sentence of a hint in this one when Davis fires Johnston and brings up Hood. And what I just said is essentially what was said in the episode. And that's the extent to we get internal squabbling and politics within the Confederacy. This episode also touches on the Fort Pillow Massacre, and the aftermath of that, like we said, was the end of the prisoner exchange between the Confederacy and the Union. But the incident itself is horrifying. And there's a horrifying first-person account of a Black Union soldier who is attempting to surrender to the Confederacy, and in response was shot several times, including in the face. And it was just a horrific account, and different stories from the massacre prompt outrage in the Union, and naturally has a very dark legacy for all of the Confederates that were involved in the massacre. Logan, do you have anything to add about Fort Pillow?
The war, especially after the introduction of Black troops, is filled with stories like Fort Pillow. And Fort Pillow is the most famous of them. You and I, Sam, have talked about the massacre at Ebenezer Creek recently. We'll see whether that gets talked about. The official policy, remember, the official policy of the Confederacy was, if Black troops are found, they are not to be taken prisoner. They are to be summarily executed on the spot, no matter what. And it is a blank check to commit massacres. The entire command of the Confederacy from the top on down is given, and it leads to really horrific atrocities. So we get this one told with eyewitness evidence, but still relatively briefly, and mostly told not for its effect on the people who experienced it or what it meant for Black soldiers, but for what it meant for the prisoner system. Still very fascinating. It's still important and interesting, but worth noting that's its place in this episode. We talked very briefly about the shortfalls of the telling of the election in this
Mhm.
episode.
Do you remember that there's an election, dear listener? Did you
Right.
remember? Well,
Right? It's sort of attempting to tell the story of the election in that the victories at Atlanta and Mobile Bay and Sheridan's attacks in the Shenandoah Valley
mhm.
are sort of this dramatic 11th hour thing that helps Lincoln win. But the story of the election itself is not really engaged with in a meaningful way. The
Mm.
gigantic Copperhead movement and its various facets are barely touched on.
The implications of a McClellan presidency,
Yeah.
the Southern sympathizers involved in the Democratic Party. I know that anyone that has a passing knowledge of the history knows that Lincoln was going to stay in office. But in spite of us knowing how the war ends, it's still an engaging narrative to be part of. So I guess that's not really an excuse to say that there can't be any tension about the story that's being told.
That's a great way of putting it. I think the episode doesn't succeed in setting up dramatic tension about the election in the beginning or in the first act of the episode. And so that means that the whole payoff at the end with Lincoln winning the election, it doesn't really land. It doesn't have a momentum. It doesn't have a coherence to it because the narrative tension is not sufficiently laid out. Maybe that's kind of the core problem of it, with this through line of the election that isn't really a through line and the disjointed sense that it has overall. So
Yeah.
I think we've hit on a lot of the things that most missed the mark for us on this
Mhm.
episode. Is there
Mhm.
anything else, Sam?
I didn't miss the mark. This one was interesting that Jeff Davis was. The documentary attributes Jefferson Davis with originating the Lost Cause narrative. And I thought that was a really interesting way of telling it, really interesting way of framing it, that even as the war was ending, I believe they call it a Confederacy of the Mind. And I thought that was really interesting that a lot of the Southerners were starting to, you know, begin to tell themselves what they needed to tell themselves as sort of consolation for the horror of the war, for the excitement of building your own nation and the pride that they had in what they were doing, to suddenly be faced with an almost certain failure. And I thought that was really interesting that the revision was already beginning.
We talked in our review of Mary Lethert Wingard's North Country series.
Hmm.
There were a few moments early on when French and British and American explorers alike experience moments where they plant their flag in the soil in northern or southern or central Minnesota and officially claim that these hundreds of thousands of acres of land are now under the control of Spain or France or England or America. And Wingard immediately points out that then, after they plant the flag, all of the Dakota and Ojibwe people just kind of go on living life as normal right after,
Yeah.
and no one on the ground at any of these flag planting ceremonies actually believes that anything has changed, that the faraway British Empire now controls this land in any real sense. But they still say that. And so this is a recurring question in history of, when does a country exist? Where do those systems of control begin and end? When do they signify the actual existence of a country, of control, of power? Does the Confederacy stop existing at Appomattox, or when they can no longer supply X amount of food to its own citizens, when it can't defend its own railroads and infrastructure from mass destruction? What is the actual moment when the Confederacy no longer exists? What is the moment when it actually does exist? It's a very interesting question. A book I think came out maybe 2 years ago that made the case that, and I'm forgetting the name of the book, but making the case that the success of the Lost Cause was essentially a rebirth of the Confederacy in some ways. So in that ways, the institutions of control of the Confederacy didn't go away. So
Mhm.
this question of, when does the Confederacy become a Confederacy of the mind, what does that mean for it to transition from a physical government to a lost cause narrative? When does that transformation occur and why? It is interesting, and we get a little taste of it in this episode.
Yeah, and you can argue that it begins at this point when Jefferson Davis starts considering it just one of mind. He's still half-heartedly trying to, literally rally the troops. But you're right. The Confederacy and the systems of control and the efforts of the Confederacy continue through Reconstruction, and the argument has been made that it continued beyond that. I hope that the next episode, I don't even want to say pick up the pace, because any story can be interesting no matter the window of time that you're trying to cover. It's really just about how it's told. And the things in this episode could have been interesting. They just weren't told in their best way. And because we've seen Ken Burns and company hit it out of the park in other episodes, they've made contact with the ball. That's just what makes this a real swing and a miss, because we know they're capable of hitting it. And this might be the rare time, Logan, when our clickbait title actually is answered. Is this Ken Burns' worst episode? So far, yeah, it is.
Yeah, so we didn't like this one.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's much competition there. So I'm interested to hear what everyone thinks. Thank you for listening. We hope that you'll listen next week. This week, Logan, this week is a big week for the 1855 History Team and its fan. This is a big week because if you go on to patreon.com/1855history today, you can reach the bonus episodes that are available to our patrons of a certain tier. So if you want to get our bonus podcasts that come out every week along with our regular podcast, you can go become a patron for the 1855 History Team. All of your help is appreciated. Thank you so much for being part of this history community. We hope you'll give that a listen. We hope you'll continue to listen to this. You can find us on Facebook and YouTube for the 1855 History Team. We're always at work on new documentaries, and we just love engaging with this history, both the good tellings, the bad tellings, and whatever you want to call our own tellings. Logan, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you very much. You have a good week.
Yeah, let's get some sleep.
Hopefully. Rip Van Winkle, 100 years. Play the opera music. Oh, boy.